What is up, harvesters? Welcome back to my subscribers, and if you're new here, welcome to Hobby Harvest. My name is Ken. So today I want to talk to you guys about how to make browse resistant food plots in the woods. And now this is applicable when you're not in the woods also, but what I have found is when you're trying to put food plots in the woods, they are so attractive because you don't have a lot of ag nearby that the deer just browse them right down to nothing right away, and you end up not having a whole lot there come hunting season, especially late in the season. So today I want to talk about how we're going to make those browse resistant so that we still have a lot of food in them during the hunting season, during the late season, and especially just to get those deer through the winter, which is another thing we're always trying to do when we put in food plots, is just maintain a healthy herd all year round. So the first thing I want to get into is okay, it's a little harder to get these food plots established in the woods than it is if you are in a big open area and you just have to turn a field into a food plot. Now, yeah, in that situation, you're maybe working on more cover and screening because you don't have what the woods has, which is cover and screening. But what we need to do when we're in the woods is first we need to clear an area for the food plot naturally, right? So we open up an area in the woods, but when you're doing that, you also need to make sure you're getting sunlight down into this. I talk about this all the time when I'm talking about food plots in the woods, and that is that we need to get that sunlight down into those food plots for as much of the day as possible, because the more sunlight we get to them, the more food will be able to grow in them, the more browse tolerant they will be. So what I like to do is when I'm standing on my food plots in the northern hemisphere, you face south, you hold your arms in a 45-degree angle, you look up into the trees, and you see what canopy is preventing sunlight from getting down to your food plots. And that's because the sun, yes, it rises in the east, it sets in the west, but it sort of arcs to the south when you're in the northern hemisphere. And in that arc is where that canopy is going to be blocking. So you want to knock down as much of that canopy to the south of your food plots as well when they're in the big woods, because that's going to get as much sunlight down there as much as possible. The more sunlight, the more browse tolerant your food plots are going to be. So once you have that established, the other thing we got to do with all of our food plots, but especially those in the woods, is get a soil test. On my northwestern Wisconsin property, I have a ton of ferns up there. And what that means is the soil is very acidic. So that means I have to take in a ton of lime to raise the pH of the soil. Now, that kind of works very well for me because what I'm doing is altering the pH of the soil so much that all of those ferns and stuff don't like growing in that higher pH soil. So it actually stunts the growth of all of the natural vegetation that I'm trying to outcompete with my food plot. And then it inspires my food plot to grow. So it kind of works both ways, as repressing what I don't want growing and helping grow what I want to grow. So get that soil right. Fertilize it, everything you can do to make sure that that soil is perfect for you. It's going to grow a better food plot, and that food plot is going to be a lot more browse tolerant. So, all right, we already covered the soil. We covered the sun. Food plots also need rain, but there's not a whole lot we're going to do about that. You're going to just have to pray for rain, and hopefully you get enough rain to keep those growing at a fast enough rate so that the deer don't just buzz them down to nothing. Now, I guess I should talk about putting a fence around it. I know some guys will put an electric fence around their food plots. That is just not something that I've ever been interested in doing. If you want to go through the effort to do that, by all means, that can work, but make sure you're putting in a double or a triple fence, because deer can jump really high and they will just jump over a single fence to get into your food plots if they want to. But it's just something I've never wanted to mess with. I have too many food plots, like I always talk about on this channel. I have a lot of compartmentalized food plots. I always say 2 acres on a 40-acre piece of land is a good acreage to start with. But I always say I would rather put in 4 half-acre food plots than to put in 1 big 2-acre food plot. And so while I'm on acreage here, another thing you can do to increase the likelihood that your food plots are going to last into the hunting season and later into the season and beyond is to just put in more acres of food plots, right? We can do that too. The problem is that's a lot of work. We're talking about more chainsaw time, more earthwork time, more whatever time to get in more food plots. But that is always an option. I always consider adding another food plot, even if it's just like a little quarter-acre food plot or something. Like I said earlier about having 4 half-acre food plots, your food plots do not actually all need to be the same size. They can be different sizes. And then what I like to do is just sort of play like connect the dots with them. So you have all of these little smaller food plots. You can connect those with like man-made deer trails, sweeten those up with things like mock scrapes, water holes, whatever. And the deer will actually move from like one attraction to the other around your property. You can actually kind of like form where they move on your property, which is really interesting to watch. So again, on my northwestern Wisconsin property, that's a property we primarily just gun hunt. I bow hunt my southeastern Wisconsin property because it's closer to where I live, so I can just hop out of work, go sit for a couple hours before dark. Works out a lot nicer for me that way. But because that northwest Wisconsin property is more gun related, when we're talking about like where we want to put our stands in relation to these attractions, you can put in 2 food plots that you can see from the same stand. They can be that close to each other. You just want to make sure that those sight lines between the 2 food plots, there's something like a barrier, be it topography, be it anything you put in there, brush, grasses, anything, a brush pile. You know, you're clearing out some trees to make these food plots. You might as well put that brush pile where it's advantageous to you. So we just want to cut down on those sight lines. We can connect those food plots like right in front of the stand. So even if you did want to bow hunt this, I would put food plot off this way, food plot off this way, man-made deer trail connecting the 2 of them, mock scrape water hole right in the middle, hunt right on that mock scrape, right where you have a nice shot, bow shot on that mock scrape. You'll be able to see both food plots from where your stand is hypothetically, but you're putting together this nice like system of improvements that's going to put deer right in front of you. But when we're doing this, guys, we have to keep in mind, you have to be very careful with your hunter ingress and your egress. You need to be able to slip into your stands undetected, because in the big woods, when we're putting in these food plots, these deer will eat every meal of the day on top of these food plots. And when they do that, they are right next to them at any given time. So to get in and get out is like very challenging. Make sure you're working on those just as much as the rest of your habitat improvements. And so while we have this in mind, I want to tell you guys a quick story. The buck I shot on that property this year, I wasn't even in the stand for 15 minutes, and he actually came from kind of the way I walked in. I kind of came in from this way, and he came in like this way behind me. You know, I was just in the stand. I was sitting there for 15 minutes. I had seen some movement a couple hundred yards off in front of me, so I was like, you know, peering between the trees trying to see what the movement was. I saw it was a squirrel, and so I was like, okay, I guess that's the movement I saw. And all of a sudden I hear this like crunch, crunch. We had a little bit of snow, so it was real quiet in the woods, and it was like right behind me. So this buck, he eventually walked within 10 yards right behind me by the time I could actually get spun around and get a shot on him. But that just shows that like if you sneak into your stands correctly and your hunter ingress and egress is very hidden, that you can slip right in. When that buck was, who knows, he was probably only 50 yards away when I got in the stand, and he just walked right in. He didn't run to me to get to me within that 15 minutes. He just walked right in, just slow rolled, would look around for a little bit, come in, and my wind was horrible for him to be right behind me. My wind was blowing right the way I walked in, so I was just waiting for him to bust me. But luckily I was up high enough and the thermals were helping me, and it was pushing my scent up above him high enough so that he couldn't actually smell me. But that is just crazy how good a good hunter ingress and egress is into these food sources when these deer are sitting right next to them all the time and pounding them, eating them every meal of the day. Now, the last thing I want to get into is like, what do you plant in these food plots? So I talk a lot about how I plant beans and peas and brassicas in my food plots. Those are actually my favorite blend, but guess what? On that big North Woods area, I can't ever get beans and peas established. As soon as they poke right out of the ground, the deer nip them off and kill them. So I never get them established. So I've played around for years with a nurse crop, with a cereal grain, trying to get something growing in there so that they nip off that cereal grain and allow those beans and peas to get started, and it just never works. They nip them off, they end up killing that half of my food plot. That food plot just ends up being cereal grains. I try to get those brassicas going, and then they end up killing those and not killing them, but they don't let them get as established as they could. And I ended up with, every time I've tried this over the years, I just don't get the food plot I want up there. So the trick is to put in cereal grains. Now, I love winter rye, but I also love diversity in my food plots. So with winter rye, the reason why that is such a huge advantage is because of the temperature at which it grows. It grows at such a low temperature. So for example, this year we got snow right before gun deer season. But I could kick that snow off of that food plot, and that winter rye was under that snow still emerald green. It was the only thing green in the entire woods. Everything was gray and brown and dead and dried and winterized, but I had emerald green winter rye underneath my layer of snow. We had an awesome season because of that. We harvested 2 bucks off of that specific food plot that I was doing that in. And so now this next year, this is something that I myself keep working on year after year. You guys are going to have to do this too. So I would love to tell you how many pounds per acre to plant. I can't do that because it's going to depend on your specific browse pressure. What you're looking to do though is plant enough of these cereal grains that the deer do nip them off and keep them trimmed. You don't want them to like stalk out, get mature, develop a seed head, because the deer aren't as attracted to that. Now in the Northwoods, if you have no egg anywhere near you, it'll probably still be attractive to them, but you want to get enough of it growing that they're actually keeping it browsed for you and keeping it maintained, almost like they're the lawnmower cutting it down for you. But you need to plant enough that they don't just eat it down to the ground and then they're not left with anything. You still want like a thick stand, and you guys are going to have to play around with how much to plant in your specific area. So that's something that I adjust every year. I think, okay, maybe I do need a little bit more. Now they're up there right now having a horrible winter, so I'm probably going to lose quite a bit of my deer herd just to exposure this winter. So next year I have to keep that in mind. I maybe don't need to plant as much because my deer herd as a whole is not going to be as big. But again, you guys are just going to have to adjust year to year. That's something you're going to have to keep in mind. Now, I don't just plant winter rye. I also plant oats. You can plant any other cereal grain too. I would experiment with what works in your area. Honestly, I just like diversity. So having a couple different things mixed together seems to work for me. So just buy whatever's cheaper. Don't let me tell you you need an exact brand of one of these things and then that's what you go and put together. Just buy whatever's cheaper. Oats I've always gone with. I've gone with winter rye. These are great things to help get that extra tonnage in those food plots. The other thing that I should bring up is cereal grains will grow anywhere. So I know I told you to get your soil right. I know I told you to get that sunlight down there. You can grow winter rye like literally anywhere. It will grow in the bed of your truck if it gets wet. So that's something just keep in mind. This stuff's really easy to grow, but if you give it that ideal situation to grow, it's going to have the most tonnage per acre, and that's what you're going for to reduce the chance that they get browsed down to nothing. And the last thing I want to mention is when you're planting those cereal grains, you can do what is called layering them, and that means that you can plant some, wait a couple weeks, plant some more, wait a couple weeks, plant some more again. So a way that this helps you is if you do that first planting and the deer are browsing it down on you, you can just layer in some more seed on top and it'll grow too. And so what you want to do for planting time is we already plant our food plots late. I know some guys plant summer food. I am always planting in like August for my fall focused food plots, but for planting winter rye, you can actually start planting a lot later, like even in September already. But if you're trying to get this established as like a lot of tonnage in the woods and you're trying to get as much food out there as possible, you can start planting in August, but I would plant like middle to late August if you're in like northern Wisconsin, northern Minnesota, the UP, that snow belt area across the top of the Great Lakes area from like Duluth to Buffalo, New York. So like I would plant more middle of August on and then layer in every couple of weeks if they're browsing it down on you. And then down in like the southern part of Wisconsin, I would just add a couple weeks. So there I would maybe target like late August, early September. I realize that bow season starts in like the middle of September, but I'm also not necessarily planting my food plots to focus on the bow opener. I'm planting them to focus on once we hit fall and all of those leaves fall off the trees, I want to have that best available food source at that time a lot more than like having a good food source the middle of September when there's still plenty of food out there for the deer to have. So just something to keep in mind if you think you are having some browse pressure. It's not lost. Just throw more seed down. You can continue to do that as long as you're hitting the right temperatures, right soil temperatures, not air temperatures, for that seed to germinate, as long as you have, everything else, the sunlight, the soil, and the water coming down. So Just one last thing that will definitely help you. Just remember, you can always throw more seed down. Of course, that's going to take you more time. Like if your properties that you hunt aren't where you live, like my northwestern Wisconsin property isn't for me. Now, what I was saying earlier too with these food plots where these deer, because they feed on them almost every day in the big woods setting like this, you're going to want cover on the edges of them too. You're going to want screening. You can use topography. I just always talk about cut down those sight lines. You don't want deer being able to see into these food plots from like all over out the woods. Cut down on those sight lines. Those deer will end up bedding down adjacent to these food plots. I actually, I got my drone back. It was in the shop and they told me to go fly it. So I stuck it up and I flew it over my southeastern Wisconsin food plot just to check it out from the air. And there were 5 does bedded down within 20 yards off the edge of that food plot while I had it up there. And that's just to show you that like these doe groups seriously do just bed down right on the edge of your food sources. And then your bucks are going to go find that next available bedding area adjacent to the food plot, but past beyond those does, because those bucks just don't like the noise of like the women and children and hanging out in those big doe family groups. But this is just something like, keep in mind that these deer could very well be just 20 yards off the edge of your food plots. So put as much screening in there so that they can't necessarily see the food plot, and especially where your stand is if you're hunting the food plot or hunting trails that go in and out of the food plot. Make sure that those sight lines are cut down so that wherever they're bedded, even if it is only like 20 yards away, that they can't see you. So that's just something extra, you know, make sure that wherever you're putting these food plots, they're screened. There's a lot of browse in there too, in addition to the food plot, because they'll also browse on sticks and shrubs and stuff in addition to the food plot, even though that food plot will be their favorite food source. And that just helps to take a little bit of pressure off of your food source as well. But guys, work on those hunter ingress and egress. Make sure that these things are hidden, that makes them feel safe. Like I was saying earlier, I won't put in a 2-acre food plot. The reason for that too is these deer are used to being in the woods all the time in these big woods settings, and they aren't going to want to be in like a big open 2-acre field. They're not used to having a big 2-acre open field in the woods. So they like those smaller 1/4-acre food plots, 1/2-acre food plots. Like I said, my 1/4-acre food plot's one of my most successful areas in the woods. We got 2 bucks off of that area this year. I'm thinking we actually have got, well, we should have gotten 6 bucks off of that specific area in the last 3 years, but the one guy missed. So he's still catching crap for that to this day. But that area has been very successful for us. We've harvested more bucks off of that area than any other area. I continue to work on other areas of that property, but for those of you that don't know, I have 2 young kids. That property's like 5.5 hours away from my house. It's hard for me to get up there and do work on it, so it's something that I just continually work on year after year. I learn something new every year. I'm not saying I know everything there is to know. I just bring what I know here to you guys so that you guys can kind of skip that learning curve and learn from what I've learned. And so if you guys feel like you got some value out of this video, go ahead, hit that like button, leave me a comment below, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.